Morning, everyone. We're ready for chapter 48 of The Treasure Hunter's Tale. The rest of the days of that week seemed to drag by as everyone was making last preparations for the great battle. The day before they started their journey, they had a whole day of prayer and fasting. They knew that there could be casualties and maybe even deaths within the next few days, and there was a solemn hush around the place. The whole town came to see them off the next day, and the officer led the vanguard. Ian got to ride in the goods cart so he would not slow the troop down with his little legs, as did Miss Wait-on-the-Lord and Hope, and some of the ladies would occasionally take up that advantage too, as their stamina was not akin to the men, for men and women are created differently, but their hearts were with them all the way. Mrs. Beloved of the King had an uncomfortable flashback when the cart drove towards that horrid building she had been taken to, where the mean lady had tried to make her take her armour off. "We had better go and check in there," she said to Mr. Newhart, "for the lady who runs that tavern, if it is still the same one, is very much involved in the evilness of the ship." "How will we know if it's her, my love?" asked her husband, "for we do not know what she looks like." Then Mrs. Beloved of the King did a very brave thing. "Then I will go in there," she said after a deep breath. "Then I will be right with you," said her husband, impressed by her valour for facing that wicked woman again, but determined that this time she would not be made to feel as she did before. "Thank you, darling," said Mrs. Beloved of the King, and the cart pulled up just outside. Mrs. Beloved of the King stepped down lightly from the cart. She could feel her heart racing, but she controlled her breathing and opened the door. "Welcome," said a voice. "How many in your party, please?" There was a young lady standing near a little table, and she was holding a menu. "Oh, sorry, I was looking for someone, actually," said Mrs. Beloved of the King, a little flustered, as clearly the tavern had changed hands. "Name?" said the young girl. I don't actually know," said Mrs. Beloved of the King, now feeling rather silly. Of course, it had been years since she was last here, and clearly things had moved on. "Oh, well, never mind," she said. "I'm sorry to have disturbed you," and she walked out. Mr. Newhart looked at his wife. She was biting her lip. "What is it, my love?" he asked kindly. "I was just thinking, what if this whole expedition is for nothing? I mean, Freddie was 7 when we escaped, and look at him now. What if they've moved on or something? Then all this would be for nothing." Her husband looked at her. "Not for nothing, my love. Think, if the ship is no longer in action, then that is a good thing. And if the pirates have moved on, then someone will be able to tell us what is happening, and we'll be able to figure things out." "Have faith," said the officer, "for I have not called you all on a fool's errand." "Then there is a purpose?" asked Mrs. Beloved of the King, equally concerned at the real possibility of what this could mean. "Of course, I always have a purpose," said the officer, smiling. "You know that to be true from many life experiences," he said, putting his arm around her. Mrs. Beloved of the King thought through her life. She thought about how she had questioned God's purpose in sending her to the ship and then finding Freddie. She thought about Levi and how his death had a purpose. She thought about all the things that had happened in her life. Some things she still could not see the purpose, but she knew she could trust the king to work them all for her good, as he had promised. "Yes, I do," she said softly, "and I trust you for them all," she said firmly. The group continued on their way until they could see the ocean and then stopped for refreshments. Mrs. Beloved of the King saw a piece of paper nailed to one of the trees, and she went over to have a look. It was a missing persons notice, and there was a large reward offered. It broke her heart to read it, for it was a girl about Hope's age. How awful to lose your daughter at that age, or any age, thought the mother, and prayed that the girl would be found. The baker's sausage rolls went down a real treat, and everyone felt fortified for the next part of their plan, which was as follows. They were going to send Freddie and Johnny as a scout party. Freddie because he knew the ship and the harbour well, and Johnny because he had learned the art of stealth while hunting dragons, and they were both young and agile, and so didn't mind crawling along the ground if necessary. Between them they cut a striking figure, making their way quietly along the tree line, bobbing up to get their bearings and then crouching down again. Ian watched them until his eyes hurt from squinting, and then they waited. While they waited, the men started practicing their tactics. They were going to try and attack the ship from all sides, which would mean some would have to go by sea. At about 2 in the afternoon, the young men returned, looking flushed. "We need to be quick," said Freddie, trying to get his breath. "They look like they were planning to go out to sea." "Oh, no," said Mr. Saved by Grace, "but I thought you said they hardly ever did." "Well, they didn't when we were on board, did they, Mother?" said Freddie quickly. "Maybe they're different people," suggested Mrs. Beloved of the King. "No, Mother," said Freddie. "I would never forget that face. The boatswain is still there, and I saw several other men I recognised, although they're much older," he said, smiling, "and most of them have got huge beer bellies." "So hopefully they'll be slower," said Johnny. "Do you think maybe they've got wind of our coming?" asked Ears to Hear quickly. Maybe, so we need to act fast, said Freddie. The women helped get the men ready for the off, making sure they said proper goodbyes to them, not knowing if they would all return. They watched as the determined band practically ran down the hill towards the town. "Godspeed," called the women, and then they were gone. "What do we do now?" asked Iron and Hope. "Now," said Miss Wait-on-the-Law, picking up the huge bundle of blankets, "now we set up camp," she said. The children were very excited and loved learning how to use long branches to create a sort of tent frame, and then use long leaves and foliage to cover the sides to make camouflaged walls. Miss Wait-on-the-Law, for all her bent-overness, was really a very good wilderness survival teacher, and soon had the children collecting sticks to make a fire. The grown women had chosen a good spot for the camp. It was away from the road, but near enough that a lookout could spot the men when they returned. There was a medium spinney of trees, which gave good coverage, and a small spring nearby, which is always a good idea when setting up camp. "And now for the soup," said Mrs. Ernest, getting out a large cast-iron cooking pot that looked big enough to have a bath in. "Let's get chopping those veg," said Mrs. My Weakness is His Strength. The band of women were excellent at making even the mundane jobs sound exciting to the children, and that made them ready and willing helpers even more. Iron was sent multiple times to the spring to collect water for the soup, which he enjoyed very much, as he felt like that was a man's job to carry the heavy things for the ladies. Hope enjoyed making the extra tree forts they had made for the possible prisoners look as cosy and welcoming as possible, as she felt that if there was anyone rescued, they would need a lot of extra love and care. And oh, how right she would be.